Welcome back. We are on our final chapter of adolescence, psychosocial development, chapter 16. All right, let's get started. Well, this entire chapter is really about the adolescent search for identity. I kind of moved some things into other areas that she covers, that the textbook covers in this chapter. I moved drug use and some other issues that I thought were more biological. I put into the biology chapter. So I'm really in this series of lectures, I'm just going to focus on a bunch of topics that really all relate to the most important thing that adolescents do, which is they're searching for their own identity. So, of course, there's going to be a heavy reliance on Erikson. Erikson says that in adolescence, we are going through our search for an identity versus being plunged into role confusion. This is the last of our just completely focused on ourselves stages of development in Erikson's model. He says that successful solution of this conflict will allow us to develop fidelity, which is another word for loyalty. So being able to figure out who we are makes it possible for us to find friendships and romantic partners that are worthy of our fidelity, of our loyalty. If we can't figure out who we are, we can be left in confusion, in what Erikson called role confusion. We don't really know who we are, what kind of person we are, what we want to do with ourselves. I mean, there are a bunch of layers of identity that can be in confusion. There are some gender differences that have been argued for with regard to how this stage is resolved and how it sets us up for the next stage of development. According to a researcher called Carol Gilligan, who was a big feminist, she taught at Wellesley College back in the 70s, she argued that maybe Erikson is right, that this stage needs to be solved before intimacy can be approached. Maybe that's true for males. Gilligan argued that she thought that's possible. Maybe his model does a good job of describing males, but she didn't think it described females accurately. She argued that for females, identity and intimacy, which is the next stage of development that we're going to talk about in adulthood, that for females, part of their identity comes from their intimate relationships. Now, as a young college student, when I was reading this, Gilligan's theory, I thought, well, that's kind of traditional of her to argue that women get part of their identity by being the doctor's wife or some other, by association kind of identity. And that's not what she meant, it turned out. What she meant is that for a female, part of how they see themselves is through the lens of, the type of person who they have attracted as a friend, or the type of person that they've attracted as a romantic partner, or how their kids turn out. That these are factors that contribute to a female's sense of self in a way that it doesn't do for males. And so she made an argument that there are some gender differences with regard to identity versus role confusion and the order of solution of the different conflicts and stuff. Now, some people have argued against her perspective, so it's not a settled issue. But I just thought I'd share with you what Gilligan said about that, since there's really not a ton of evidence for anything having to do with Erikson's stage theory. So a lot of it is all just sort of, small studies that may or may not support all aspects of Erikson's theory. All right, well, let's move on. Let's talk about what we all agree on. So a follower of Erikson, whose last name was Marcia, said, we don't just develop our identity overnight. We go through a series of different statuses, and some of us may get stuck in one status for longer than others of us. Some of us might move very quickly through the stages or the different statuses. So let's talk about them. So we have two continua here. One is the commitment, no commitment continuum, and the other one is the exploration, no exploration continuum. And when you look at how these interact with each other, you end up with 4 different identity statuses. The first one is called foreclosure. This is where the person's identity they don't really search, they don't really do any kind of exploration, but they make a commitment. A good example he gave was, what if a person just takes over their role in the family that was offered and set up for them, and they just go, okay, well, I guess it's my role, and they don't really search or question, but they just sort of slide right into the role that was already set up for them. I'm listening to the British History podcast, and it reminds me of how the firstborn son is that it's already foreclosed what you're doing for your life. You're going to be the king, right? Like the firstborn son of the king is going to be the king. Unless it was during the Anglo-Saxon times, in which case there was a lot of fighting over everything. But anyway, I'm not sure if anybody listens to my lectures, so sometimes I just talk to myself. Another type of status would be the achievement status, and that's where there's commitment to the role after a period of exploration. And so achievement the term refers to the fact that the identity wasn't just given to you, but you had to achieve it through your own exploration and questioning and those kinds of things. The next one is where you haven't really done any exploration, but you still haven't committed to any particular identity, and he called that diffusion. So maybe you drop out of school, and you go, well, you know what, I'll just flip burgers, something will work out, I'm not going to worry about it, I'll just, see what comes. That would be a person who's kind of got a diffusion attitude, where they're not actively working to figure out what they want to do, and they're not particularly concerned about it, or at least outwardly they say they're not concerned about it. A moratorium is where, again, there's no commitment, but the moratorium refers to the period of exploration, right? So I'm going to take a job right now. I know this isn't my final job, but at least I'll learn some stuff from it, and maybe it'll help me to figure out whether this is the field I want to be in or not. That kind of thing. And so a moratorium is part of the exploration. It's not sort of dropping out of exploration like diffusion does. It's part of the exploration. Again, we have some gender differences in this. According to Marcia, it's like critical for males to go through a period of crisis. If they are foreclosed, for example, and never go through any kind of crisis, where they're not really exploring or trying things on, they may later on in life run into identity issues where they may feel like a fraud. This isn't what I really wanted, but I didn't have the power to say anything at the time. Like this can cause a crisis later on because they didn't go through the crisis when they were younger and it was the appropriate time for exploration. For females, Marcia has observed that foreclosure can be less disruptive for females than it seems to be for males. If females slide into the expected role, it's less likely to manifest itself in disorder when they get older, where they're like, oh, who am I? I don't really understand myself. Or I should say, at least there's not much difference in the kind of disorder that a female would experience at midlife, whether she was foreclosed or she achieved her identity through achievement. So there are some gender differences again, where it seems like for both Marcia and Erikson's models that for males there's a really important figuring out who you are phase, and you really have to, according to Marcia, go through that period of figuring it out. If it's just sort of handed to you, it's not, you don't have a sense of ownership as much, is the idea. So there are these 4 different statuses. What we would expect an adolescent to be in is usually moratorium. Like that's what we would expect because they don't know exactly who they are, and they're trying on different friends, they're trying on different styles of dress, they're trying on different genres of music. Maybe during adolescence they get their first job and they're working some part-time job and like that, and that's helping them to grow and develop. But this is very normal in adolescence. Maybe you played a sport in middle school that you never played again, right? Because it was just something you were trying out. I remember 8th grade, I had this friend in gym, and she wrote the most effusive, "We are the best friends, I love you so much, can't wait to see you when we're at the high school," like all these things. And a few years ago when we were moving, I came across my junior high school yearbooks. I read through it and it says, love Andrea. And I'm like, who is this? did not know who was such a great friend in 8th grade that they would write such an effusive thing in my yearbook. And so then I looked at her picture. I'm like, oh my gosh, I do remember her, right? It's just a really great example of how somebody who you're trying on, right, in 8th grade, is this the kind of person who is my friend? Is this the kind of person who would be my lifelong friend? That's really common in 7th, 8th grade. In that same yearbook, I think I mentioned I married my husband was in my same class, and so he was in my class in junior high. I didn't know him then. And I found a picture of him running track. And I was like, what? You ran track? And he goes, yeah, that one year, the guidance counselor talked me into it. And so I tried it. And it's just really typical in, middle school. I was in choir in middle school. I was never in choir any other time in my life. I was just in middle school. You try that stuff on. Very normal to be going through moratorium in adolescence. Less likely to be foreclosed. And you're like, yep, I already know who I am, I already know who I like, what kind of music I like, I already know everything, nothing to see here, I'm done. Like, very uncommon to see that kind of foreclosure. It's uncommon to see diffusion during adolescence when, between puberty and the onset of emerging adulthood, that period of time when you're still in school, it's uncommon to see diffusion. I showed you the dropout rates have really dropped. Most people are sticking with school. They know that it's the best thing to get them, started in life. And so we have a small 10 or 15% of students who do that. Most students are not in diffusion, they're in moratorium. Most of us do not fully achieve our identities in adolescence. Even Erickson said that you can still be struggling with identity through your 20s. Like, that's completely normal. So if you're at all thinking to yourself, man, am I in diffusion? First off, if you're listening to me, you're probably enrolled in a college class. And so you're probably in moratorium, where you're taking steps, you're trying to figure it out. Maybe you haven't achieved it yet. Others of you may have full identity achievement. You may be older, or you already figured it out, and you may have that status. But if you're listening to this lecture, you're probably not in diffusion, where you're just like, yeah, I don't care, I don't want to grow, I don't want to develop, I'll just wait and see if something's going to fall into my lap, right? You might even be listening to this class because of foreclosure, because maybe it's always been the case that you wanted to pursue whatever career takes this class as a prerequisite, right? Maybe you always knew that, and so your identity was achieved through foreclosure, and that's why you're listening to this. You're just probably not in diffusion if you're listening to this. Probably not. I don't know you. I have not analyzed you, but I'm going to say probably not. So that's just like a general issue, establishing identity. But let's talk a little bit about subsets of our identity, like our sexual identity. When we in psychology talk about sexual identity, we're usually talking about how we see ourselves as sexual beings. So one of the things that is really common in adolescence, I'm not going to go into detail in this. If you really find this topic per se really super interesting, you can take my human sexuality class. But masturbation is a really common activity in adolescence. And nevertheless, it still is only about 80% of boys and about 40% of girls who report that they engage in masturbation. So while it is a common activity, it is not a guarantee that everyone engages in it. Another aspect of our sexual identity is who we are attracted to. Are we attracted to people of our same sex, people of the other sex, or any person, and we're not really concerned about their sex? Like, sexual orientation is what we're talking about there. I'm going to go ahead and break here because I want to go spend a significant amount of time talking about the factors that go into determining our sexual orientation. So I will see you in the next video.